Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I feel like it's been ages since we've been here, but it really hasn't been that long. And tonight we have a special guest. So, hello, Pippa, and hello, Caroline.
Hello, ladies.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Pippa. So lovely to have you here.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So, Pippa is a birth trauma specialist. She's a doula. She does a myriad of things. She's very active in the community and has some incredible initiatives, which is how I found her actually from her Facebook page, Fantastic Futures. And I've had the pleasure to get to know her. And I thought we might have her on for a conversation because birth trauma has a lot of impact on people, on mothers, on families, and not even just to talk about that, but how that really influences the whole of communities and families, and how that's flowing onto a lot of the other work that Pip is doing is incredibly interesting. So I'm so glad you could join us, Pippa. I'm sure that we're going to have some really good conversation tonight, really good conversation, some really nice questions.
That'd be great. More than happy to answer some great questions. It's a pleasure to be here. It's such an important topic.
So tell us a little bit about, like, I know you're a doula and you haven't always perhaps been focused on the birth trauma, but from what I hear, when I hear you speak, it's like you've sort of been led to your passion through what you've done recently or, over the years. And that definitely is your passion from what I hear. So how did that sort of come about?
Well, it's a little bit convoluted. So initially, I had my first baby. She's now 19 and a half, and I experienced birth trauma in that space. And my first response to that was to get angry and then make a difference and do something about it. So in that, about 3 months after she was born, I realized that I was not okay with what had happened. And so I went on a journey of discovery, and that's how I became a doula. I was like, okay, I'm going to make sure that other women don't have to be in this space, that they don't feel unsupported and coerced in their birth. So I'll make a difference that way. And so that's what I did. I became a doula and I started supporting women through birth. I went on to have 3 more children in various locations and in various ways, all with the support of my own business partner and doula, which was just magic to have for myself also. As part of that journey, I headed up a group of women who got a birth centre built for Townsville in Queensland, and so that took about 6 years. And during that time, I also became very active in, because my first birth had been a Caesarean, and then I had 3 natural births after that. I became very active I set up a group for women it was called the Birth After Caesarean Support and Information Group. And so we met monthly and we had lots of conversations around, what had happened and how it had happened, what women's choices were, and those sorts of things. And as part of that, we recognized that there was a lot of women with birth trauma. There was a lot of stuff to unpack. There was a lot of things going on. And as a doula, I saw how women's trauma impacted their next birth. Now, sometimes that wasn't birth trauma. Sometimes that was sexual trauma. Sometimes that was mother or sister wounds. Sometimes that was childhood trauma. But you can, when you watch enough births and a part of enough births, you can see how that trauma is carried forward into a woman's birthing experience, because giving birth is such an open and vulnerable time, right? So we go to the edge of ourselves and we become a portal for, this being to join us earthside. And so we go right to our very edge. And often in that space, we deal with anything that we haven't yet dealt with. So I did that for quite a while, and then I moved away from that space for a bit because it can be very taxing on the system. And so I moved into the corporate world, and that was I found that very toxic. And I have obviously 4 daughters, and so that was pretty full on for me. And I ended up with adrenal fatigue because I wasn't in a space where I was really fulfilling my passion, where I was reaching out and doing what I needed to do with my life. So, as a result of all of that, the adrenal fatigue kind of came. I was so lucky at that point in time to discover a process called TRTP, the Richard's trauma process. And I was actually answering an ad for a sales rep, and I'm like, this ad is calling me. This is my job, right? And and in the process of finding out more about the job, I'm like, I have to do this thing. Like, I actually need this for me, so that no matter what job I get, I can be the best me, and I can be the best mum I can be. And so I did it, and my life changed. Within 2 weeks, I was just on top of the world again. Because I'm a bit of a go-getter. I'm that woman, if you ask a busy woman to do something, if you need something done, you ask a busy. I'm that woman, right? I'm the woman everybody asks to do stuff, and I get stuff done. But at the time, I wasn't able to. So that really shifted me back into that space of being able to do everything I knew I wanted to do. And I actually did get the job a few months later. And I went to work for Judith, and 3 days in, I said, Jude, I have to do the training, right? She's like, yeah, you do. And I did it that very next week. I was very lucky she was running a course the next week. And so I did it, and I said, I have to take this to women. I have to take this to women with birth trauma. And she said, that would be amazing. I will support you 100%. And she has ever since. She's been amazing. So yeah, and I finally feel like it's not just a birth debrief we're doing. We're actually doing something that can impact a woman's mothering. And when you impact a woman's mothering, you're able to impact a family. And when you change families, you change culture. And when you change culture, you change the world, right? So yeah, that gets me up in the morning.
Oh, what a brilliant story. It's kind of came full circle, Pippa, didn't it? From the start.
Really did.
It's like you had to go on a journey, and you had a seed of what you wanted to do, but then you had to kind of explore what you didn't want nearly to find out, what you needed, and then to find your own support along the way as well, and your own training, like to support yourself, Yeah, that's amazing. What an amazing story and journey back to your purpose. Fabulous, isn't it? Very inspiring, Lisa.
Well, thank you.
Oh, it is. And we've talked a lot about that, the fact that when mothers come into their true state and into their intuitive wisdom, they actually hold this incredible, like they're the hearth of the home and the heart of the home. And it just impacts everyone. Like I have a client that was just saying to me the other day, when she started to do her work, all of a sudden her kids, their behavior changed. She started to regulate herself emotionally. She became calm. She got rid of the chaos inside. And everything changed. So I'm totally on board with that, Pippa. I think mothers are so important because they can totally impact everyone in the household, and that just flows out from there. So
absolutely, yeah, and I totally agree with that. And often say about that, society is all homes, little homes is what society is. It's all individual little homes kind of stuck together. And if the mother, like that, when you change your own energy and your own way of coping with life and your own traumas, like you talk about, which is really, really interesting, fascinating to see, to hear you say about what comes up in the birthing process. I think that's fabulous. Actually, I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that and how, I suppose it's kind of out of the, I suppose our culture is so much about maybe running away from that and not entering into the pain and what can happen when we do kind of enter into that and face it and then come through it. And it can be a transformational space, not just having a child, but how you come out of that afterwards and how different you can be. And then whether you got support beforehand, and how would you feel like, I suppose you support women before they go in or after, or both? I wonder.
Yeah, so I mean, as a doula, I support women before labour begins. So we provide that support during prenatal, and then during the birth, and then into the postnatal period. It's interesting, when I talk to a lot of mums, the biggest thing that they talk about during birth or during postnatal time, when you meet them a year down the track or 2 years down the track, it's always about having been isolated or having not been supported. When we're talking about obstetric violence during birth, that's a different sort of thing. But in the postnatal time, it's often about not being supported. So we've got two spaces. Well, there's actually three spaces where women experience trauma, and so we think about that maternity year as a whole, and we call it birth trauma because women talk about that a little bit more, although they never used to. But it could be that they were scared during the pregnancy. You know, I got off the phone with an old friend today, and her daughter's been told that she has placenta previa, and that's that's catastrophic. Well, it turns out in talking to her that she has potential for the placenta to be too close to the cervix. But she's just had this huge emotional journey, right? This huge trauma that's just occurred, which has not only affected her but gone across the placenta into the baby. So this, and her mother's had the same thing. So this huge upheaval, and if that were to continue for for a long time, and if she wasn't already in a state of balance, that has the potential to have long-term effects. Now, I happen to know this woman's not already in balance. She already suffers from considerable anxiety. So this sort of thing can be the thing that tips her over the edge into a place of, being truly anxious or having that prenatal depression and things like that. So those things can be really, really big. And then we have obviously birth trauma, and we often have a lot of obstetric violence. Obstetric violence is huge, and we have PTSD from birth that occurs in around 10 to 20% of women. 30% of women will say they have birth trauma, but that's only the ones who talk about birth trauma, and a lot of women don't identify with that. They'll say it was awful or whatever, but they don't identify with trauma because that's when your baby nearly dies or when you nearly die, right? So that's how they consider trauma often, although that's not really a full definition. But then you've got women who struggle with breastfeeding, or maybe they had a baby who had to go to special care or to the neonatal intensive care unit, or there are all sorts of other things that can go on postnatally as well that can cause that stuff. And all of those things get stuck in our system, in our body, and in our subconscious. And when something's stuck in our subconscious, it's going in our body, right? Because what's going on in our subconscious runs the body. So if we're stuck in a state of fight, flight, freeze or something, that's going to resonate right through our body. So we really need to deal with that in order to be able to not bring that forward and take that on to other pregnancies, because that trauma is actually laid down in our DNA. We know that trauma runs for up to 3 generations in our DNA. We don't want to pass that stuff on. But obviously mums are the last on the line to get help, and we don't understand just how powerful we are and just how much we actually need to do our own work, if not for our own sake but for the family's sake. It's so important.
I love that. And there's a couple of things that occurred to me then, because I've had a few experiences in the last few weeks with the medical profession, because the implements now are so refined that they're finding things that may or may not be there, and there's no accountability for how that lands on the actual people. Like I've had an instance in with my older daughter who's had something come up, and I'm just like, yeah, but like they're finding these things now because their instruments are so refined. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. They're telling you this so that they cover their asses, I guess, in case something happens. And instances, what you said before, like pregnant women that have been told things may be the case, that there's a problem with the baby, and then they have 2 weeks of absolute fear and anxiety and just freaking out until they can go and get the further testing done, which, by the way, probably costs them a lot of money. So the whole system that's being set up now, it's pretty frightening. And yeah, I'm hearing you. I've actually seen that in my life the past couple of weeks, and I think that lack of accountability for the way things land on people emotionally, it's really concerning.
Absolutely. I think the way it's phrased, the way it's given very clinically, and not like it's ported in it's just a language, I guess, around it, could really improve, couldn't it? Because that would be, I suppose, and then for women not to have support, if they don't have a doula like yourself, to come back and kind of support them in the process of that seems to be a great addition to what's there, because we can't change the whole system. The system is there as it is, but how can we support the system until things maybe change, culturally? So I think what your addition to the process is a beautiful solution to that problem where, if there is that, I suppose that it is like the midwifing of the process in a supportive, in a very holistic way. So, you're kind of, especially I loved what you said about if a woman is already kind of anxious and has an anxious disposition, and this just actually brings it to light, because you might understand that she has anxiety and she's living with anxiety because she's lived with that all her life, and her mother has maybe lived with it all her life, and her grandmother has lived with it all her life. So that's normal. And even though normal isn't actually healthy, it's not actually come to light until it gets to a stage where it's acute as such. And I suppose for you to be there, to be the rational mind behind the situation, is fabulous support for a woman in that situation. So you can maybe give her the tools. And do you teach that as well? Like, how do you help the anxiety and the symptoms of the anxiety? I know, through the process, do you teach like mindfulness or meditation, or how do you help women in that way and helping them help themselves, I guess?
Yeah, so when obviously being available to women is part of that doula side, but when we talk about the TRTP side, the Richard's trauma process, when I work with women in that space, it actually works very very differently. So in the first step, we're actually going to we go in and we rewrite the subconscious core beliefs, those limiting the beliefs that keep a woman stuck in the patterns of her life. So it might be that her year one teacher told her she was stupid, and so that pattern is laid down. And then it might be that that her mum called her lazy, and that pattern is laid down. It might be that other things, dad left when she was a little girl, and so that pattern of abandonment is laid down. Everyone who's supposed to love me will leave me. So we actually rewrite those unhelpful patterns in that first session. In the second session, we actually we take the emotional charge out of the past. So when the body is stuck in that fight, flight, freeze, or appease, it's because all of these trauma events are still running in the subconscious. They're still running because the part of the brain that turns things off and puts them into long-term memory, if a system's not in balance, they don't work. And so things never get turned off and put into long-term memory. So those videotape loops, or those traumas that are still running in the subconscious, which run the body, they get turned off, and they actually then become so then the body self-regulates again, right? The nervous system re-regulates. And so the triggers disappear. The triggers that are running the show, that are causing you to behave in that way or respond in that way with anxiety or whatever the case may be. OCD is huge, but it's just a symptom of the system saying I'm not safe, right? The whole body and the whole subconscious is saying I'm not safe, and so they respond to these triggers. So if we turn that stuff off, which is what we do in the second session, we turn those off, and then we're actually not being triggered anymore. So we don't actually have to teach how do we manage this, because they're not there to manage. They're just not there. So it is, and then our whole system works properly too, right? So people with gut issues, I worked with a woman about a year ago now, and she rang me about 8 months later, and she said, when I did this process, I felt great. Like, I knew that I was able to get on top of my life. She said, but I didn't tell you this, but I'd had a 25-year gluten intolerance ever since she'd had some massive trauma in her life. All of a sudden, she realized, I'm actually not gluten intolerant anymore. I can eat what I want. Like, we didn't even deal with that. It's just a byproduct of having a system. Yeah. It was a symptom of a system that wasn't regulated, that was in a fight, flight, freeze state. When you're in fight, flight, freeze, you don't use your gut, right? Because if you're running from a tiger, you don't need to digest your Weet-Bix. You need to run, right?
Yes.
So it's all these systems, and we have so many gut issues now. So many gut issues.
Oh yeah,
Absolutely.
true. Another question I have for you, Pippa. This is a very. I read this the other day, and I was really surprised. And I'd like to put this to you. It's a little bit divergent from where we were just then.
Okay.
But I read this article, and this woman was talking about birth rape, and I had never heard the term before. and I just heard you discuss birth, like obstetric violence, which is what I perceive is birth rape. And I had never, ever thought about that as a thing, but I can absolutely see it as a thing. And I'd just love you to, can you just fill me in a little bit more on what that is and give me a little bit more detail about it, because I was really curious about it.
Yeah. So I think around 30 years ago, Sheila Kitzinger, who is she was a very well-known birth worker, and she wrote a lot of books on birthing and natural birthing. She wrote an article which coined that that phase, birth rape. She talked about it being birth rape because so many women, she actually had 2 daughters who were working on a hotline for women who'd experienced rape, and she realized that a lot of the same terms, words, phrases that are talked about in sexual assault and rape are the same things that are spoken about when a woman experiences obstetric violence. So, you know, those feelings of being violated, that lack of control, and sometimes it is very physical. You know, women will agree to one thing, so maybe they'll agree to a vaginal exam, and whilst that happens, the midwife or the doctor will go in and actually do a stretch and sweep and maybe break the waters and do some other things while they're in there, but without permission. That's a violation. And it's illegal, but it happens. And because they say, oh, we're just going to do this, nobody realizes that they actually didn't have to have that happen, or that they had a choice around that. And professionals know that when you do a vaginal exam, it's very different to doing a stretch and sweep, but also the potential is there for any of those things to happen, and they should be warning women first that that these things can happen. The coercion is extraordinary in birth. The amount of coercion that goes on to get women to do it the way they want to do it, and they pull the dead baby card all the time. So women then feel like they become this vessel. They're not important. How they are treated isn't important. The things that happen to them are not important as long as they have this healthy baby. And then they get to the other end and they have this healthy baby, and they try to express these feelings of violation or loss of control or abuse, and they're told, oh, well, at least you've got a healthy baby. Well, what does that do to a woman? That makes a woman feel like her feelings are not valid. Yeah, she's invisible. They're not valid. She should just be grateful. So now she's a bad mum as well, because she's not just grateful, because she's got her own feelings and her own thoughts about the process. So that's, you know, it's huge. But the obstetric violence and the birth rape is catastrophic in lots of countries. And it depends a little bit on how the system is set up as well. So different medical systems will have different ways of doing things. So if you go to the States, in the States, they have, it's all obstetric led, right? You have labor and delivery nurses, not necessarily midwives. And in fact, they actually virtually outlawed midwifery in most states of America over the past 20 years. And it's only just starting to have some, you know, some comebacks. But every labour and delivery nurse is responsible to an obstetrician. So the obstetrician gets to choose what happens. And because of the way that private and public health work over there, if you basically have no choice about, an obstetrician can simply say, well, I'm not going to care for you. Whereas in Australia, if you go into the public system, they actually can't refuse you treatment. They cannot refuse to care for you. So there's a slightly different power play there in different countries. So lots of different spaces will have different things happen. I know things haven't actually been amazing in Ireland either. It's actually been, there's lots of stuff that's come out of Ireland that's been really traumatic for women.
Absolutely.
Over the past, yeah.
Yeah, I've so many stories of friends of mine as well, and I suppose again there's then the emergence of like a lot more doulas and a lot more home birthing. And I have a friend actually who went back about 5 years ago and did midwifery herself, and people getting interested in a space and supporting women. So I suppose out of people speaking about it, so that's what's so important, isn't it? And you mentioned that where people find it hard to talk about the trauma, and actually, it's amazing across all issues around women is the fact that people don't realize that it wasn't okay for certain things to happen, and not to have a language even around understanding that or being able to speak about it. And then when they hear other women, they go, oh, wow, that happened to me too, and then we can find solutions, but we can't find solutions to problems if we don't know where the problems are, so I find that refreshing to feel that like there are so many people getting interested in changing the culture around birthing and supporting women in that. It's such a massive transition, isn't it, for women to have a child, especially first. I remember having my first child, the amount of fear and the amount of, I suppose it's a completely, you transform completely from one person to another. You're not the same person after that birth,
Yes.
It just, and you're going into the unknown, and it's that whole like looking on to see older women, and you're really, you want to have that guidance from older women because you start to value that. You're kind of like, that they know something that you don't know, and that they have this wisdom and robustness about them. And it's kind of like you start to want to gravitate towards that naturally, because it's like your confidence starts to naturally become more, I suppose, like community based, I guess, and it becomes more natural that you want the guidance of people who have the experience rather than like maybe the doctors, isn't it? It to me, that's the way I felt. And, I think the coldness of the terminologies around, birthing can be very frightening in that vulnerable space, I guess, So, I love to hear what you're doing, and opening up the conversation seems to be really healing. Did you find that,
Yeah, look, I mean, just creating conversation around it is good. And I think one of the things that in Western culture particularly, there tends to be oh, well, I had it worse kind of culture between women. We don't
Right.
actually necessarily have a culture where we can support women. So I mean, how many times do you go to mother's group and everybody's like, oh, my son's already walking, but then when it comes to the bad stories, it's about, well, my son's not sleeping through the night, or nobody wants to say, well, my baby does sleep through the night, because that's not PC, because what about all the mums whose babies aren't sleeping through the night?
Wow.
And then, when I was having babies, you still had to go to the bank to pay a bill or to get money out, right? And you had to stand in line. And you could not go to the bank and stand in line without some old lady telling you her terrible birth story, And it's interesting because my mum will say to me, oh, well, we just didn't have birth trauma back in my day. Yeah, you did. And I've worked with women who are 70. It's just that nobody allowed you to identify with that. Nobody validated that was an issue. And unless as women we stand up and say, no more, we can't allow women to be treated like this. But the problem is when we go back into our home, we're in our home and we're told we should just be grateful and that we have this healthy baby. And I listened to a woman on the weekend at a postnatal support herbal support training I did, and she just had a baby like 7 days ago, and she said, I need to talk to you. I have so much trauma. And the next sentence she said, but it's okay. I have a beautiful baby. Well, it's not okay. It's maybe moderated by the fact that she has a beautiful baby to adore and to love, but it doesn't make it go away. And we need to not assume that we can just make it go away with time, and I meet a lot of women, particularly women who've had Caesars, who want to have a vaginal birth the next time, and they're riding on this idea that having a natural birth next time will mean that they will heal their previous birth. No,
Mm.
that's a lot of pressure, because you know what that means, that if you don't have the outcome that you're looking for, if that birth isn't the dream birth that you were hoping for, then you're going to be crushed, and then you've got 2 children to deal with while you try to deal with crushed dreams. No, let's just deal with your stuff. Let's deal with your stuff, and then let this birth be something that you work towards, but isn't the crux of what heals you. Yes, birth is so empowering, but it can be any type of birth that can be empowering. And you know what women remember is not what happened, but how they were treated. And we need to. Terry Schilling did my first ever doula training back 19 years ago, and she said, your job as a doula is to make sure, she said, you need to think about how will this woman remember how she was treated. Everything you do needs to be about how is this woman treated. And so, you know, that's where we should be thinking about everything we do. How does this woman remember how she was held, how she was treated? And so some of my work in, you know, the community space is really about that right now, getting a space where women can feel held by other women. And, you know, Lisa and I get to be part of this group that meets weekly, and you know, it's for maidens, mothers and grandmothers. You know, I'm about to become a grandmother, which feels really weird to say. But you know, my daughter's there as a maiden, and Lisa's daughter's there as a maiden, and there are young mothers and there are older mothers, and then there are those of us who, you know, are going into grandmother stage, and that's amazing. What wisdom is shared, and they feel so held, these young women, and that's beautiful, right? And as older women, we need to feel okay about sharing that wisdom, and we need to feel okay about holding these girls, you know, and giving them a soft place, giving them a cuddle when they need a cuddle. I see you. I see that it's hard, you know. Here, let me give you dinner. Let me come and fold your washing. You know, we have a different time space now. We're not as exhausted, although teenagers are quite another story. But you know, I'm drowning in teenagers at the moment. But they that's, you know, that's a whole nother thing. And you know, when you're in that space, how good does giving feel? You know, I
I
love
love that
giving
idea.
as a way of,
I love the idea of all the women, the different ages coming together like that. You know, it's fabulous, isn't it? Because, you know, it supports, everybody feels good in that space, don't they? Feel like they have a purpose, you know, and then the wisdom's be passed on, and then the younger generation kind of absorbing it, you know, and not even realizing really until later on in their life nearly that the benefit of that, you know, it kind of, that's fabulous. I love that idea. It's amazing. Yeah, gorgeous.
Yeah, because it is very beautiful.
very blessed
I think
to be a part of
there's
it.
a lot of wisdom that gets. Well, there's a lot of like really beautiful magic that gets passed when you have these intergenerational connections. You know, like, and I even think coming into like younger girls being influenced by teenagers, and you know, like that intergenerational sort of interaction, because, well, I mean, let's face it, even our daughters are probably sometimes more open to hearing something from somebody else that may not be our generation, you know. So it's like you want to get your children in those sorts of environments. You know, I think it's just beautiful. I think we should really create more of that in our communities.
Absolutely. And I find actually the older women are more open sometimes to the younger women, especially, you know, I suppose it's hard for mothers sometimes because they're so connected to their own daughters, but for other older women to talk more openly to the younger, and they listen more a little bit, I think, as well. And they can, you know, just hearing the funny stories as well as the kind of difficult stories. They're the younger girls are really hungry for that, and then the older women are just, they have a little bit more perspective on things as well, and they can put it into context in a larger, you know, the whole journey of their life, I guess, and how it's impacted, you know, like what you're saying, the trauma, how that impacts them. You know, I suppose maybe they're coming into more of a stage of realization and self-awareness and stuff like that as well, and you know, they can distill the wisdom of their lives and then pass it on. It's just fabulous. Yeah, it really is. And that's how we're designed. We're designed to be in community. We're designed to work, to live together. We're designed, that's a natural way of being, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and 200 years ago, that was normal.
Yeah, exactly.
Before the industrialization and, people moved into cities, you had a village and you were at your sister's birth and you were at your mother's birth, usually, because she'd have a whole bunch of babies, and you might be taken to the birth of the woman next door, and you would have seen that, and then you would have supplied her with food for a couple of weeks, and somebody would have gone next door to take her older children and for the day and would have gone over and made sure her washing was done, and all of these things were just normal. It just happened. And from I'm doing my last uni assignment at the moment, and it's gender, sexuality and culture, and I'm talking about obstetric violence, but birth is a very gendered activity. But the culture around birth and postnatal is even more gendered. And women too, medieval women knew that this was a sacred space for connectedness between the feminine in the community, and it was a woman-dominated space, and it was their thing, and men had their space within it, but it was limited.
That's actually something that I've often thought about, is because now it's very common to have men in the labour with women, and sometimes I have wondered if that's actually a really healthy situation for the relationship with the man and the woman, and because I wonder if having women there to support women, and like you just said, it's like it is a very sacred space for women. And I know that a lot of women want their husbands there, but I wonder sometimes if that takes away from that real sacred feminine power that you get when you have other women supporting you in that space. I don't know. I'm just throwing these ideas out there.
In my experience, men do wonderfully at birth. They actually do really well at birth if they're supported. So, often you'll get a man who says to his wife or partner who's considering having a doula, he'll say, but then what am I supposed to do? Right? If you're having this doula, she's going to support you. What do I do? Well, no. The best thing about having a doula is the dad has a toolbox. So the doula knows what to do, and her job is to make dad look really good, so he knows what to do, right? And so she's saying to him, the mum remembers that dad was amazing, and the dad's giving the doula a high five behind his back, going, thanks for that, because she helped him be amazing, because it's not always intuitive for them. Some men, it is intuitive for them, and they do amazing things, and she just wants his strength and his grounding. But then sometimes she will look around the room and she needs to see a woman who's done it. She needs to look in a woman's eyes and go, because, if a man says, you're doing great, honey, you're doing awesome and you're almost there, and she can look at him and go, right, you don't know what you're talking about. Whereas she can look at a woman and the woman can say, you're doing so good and you're almost there. And she can go, okay, she knows, and she's told me, and that's different. And so I think we can have men in that space, but men need to be supported in that space. And it was interesting, and I was at a gathering the other day, and the question was asked, how do we support dads in the postnatal time? How do we because men often suffer from birth trauma as well, because they feel so out of control. And most men are used to being professionals in their field. They're used to knowing what they're doing, especially when they get to the age of having children, right? They've reached a level of competence, and all of a sudden they're incompetent in this space, and it's such a vital and important space, so all of a sudden they're lost. And so she said, how do we support them to be able to do the things, because they still have a need to go out and work, they still have a need to provide for their family, they still have these they still need to just even be with their mates sometimes to be able to connect on a different level. So how do we support them so that they transition better? And my answer to that question was, as women, we support the mother. And if we turn up to support the mother so that he can come in a different way, rather than he has to do all the things for her, he gets to do the things he wants to do for her. And so he shows up in a different way. And it's voluntary then rather than necessary, because the women in her life come and actually support her and they provide for her. Which is beautiful. There was two concepts that I was introduced to recently. One was the 7 sisters. So you pick 7 women in your life, and each one takes a day of the week. And for 4 weeks, that woman comes to your home and she brings a meal and she does whatever you need. So if that's picking up some groceries, or if that's folding your washing, or if that's holding the baby so you can have a shower, whatever that might be, these seven women just take 1 day a week each, and they come to your home, and somebody else organizes it. Nobody has to be part of that. Now, a lot of women in our community wouldn't have 7 women, and that's okay too. But if we can try and change that somehow, then that would be amazing, right?
There's a lot of retired women out there that are twiddling their thumbs,
Would
wanting to
love
be
it.
connected.
Would
They
love
want to
that.
be connected.
100% there is, yeah. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the village kitchen that we're going to start, but it'll start small. But the other one that I really liked was Stephanie, who was the herbalist who ran this training on the weekend. She was talking about the concept of 5, 5, and 5. So the first 5 days post baby should be in bed. The next 5 days should be on the bed, and the 5 days after that should be near the bed. And she shouldn't be doing anything that isn't baby or personal related. So, and no washing dishes, no washing clothes, no cooking food. So even if we can support women for the first 15 days, we actually can make a huge difference to how she recovers postnatally and how she bonds with her baby and sets up breastfeeding and adapts to life as a mum. Because you said it before, Carolyn, we actually we become mothers. We are birthed ourselves as a completely different being. We will never be the same after birthing a baby. And each baby, that's a different journey.
Yes, yeah, completely. And Pippa, that's amazing. I'm just thinking about all the cultural differences and norms, because say, for example, in Ireland now we have you get 6 months maternity leave, and then it's actually been brought in that the fathers can actually take parental leave as well, to support the mother. And then, but that's evolved and changed over the last, say 10, 20 years, and all I suppose awareness and legislation changing around that, which is really important in the legal space. And then also thinking about, my sister-in-law in America, which I remember going over to support her. I went over when she had the baby, particularly for it, even though I have small children myself, which I felt really hard leaving, going across the Atlantic. I remember thinking this just doesn't feel right, but I had to do it because there was no one, no sisters, and my mother was about 5 hours away in the middle of America, and she gets 2 weeks off, 2 weeks leave, back into work after 2 weeks in America, and which I just thought, I just couldn't get over it. I was just so upset for her, that she had to be back in work. I don't know how you would actually do it. It's completely criminal, and just talk about trauma, having to leave and be back in a very stressful job, and she's trying to breastfeed and everything as well, and pumping in in trying to do it in space and work and keeping that going, and just unbelievable. Just not societies set up completely not with women in mind, or the natural process of living, that we have children, we are, homemakers, it's, and I think, there's so many different cultural norms, and then when you talked about the men, and I remember when I lived in Scotland, they had tradition over there where, in one way, it was funny because they could be there for the birth, but then they had a tradition of wetting the wean's head, as they call it. Yeah, so they're going to the pub with the men after, and it was really a bonding thing, for the men, that they go, but it was their way of, it was a traditional thing, their way of bonding in celebration, in a solidarity nearly, you know what I mean? And it was this, wetting the wean's head, and it was just this big, and actually the women over there didn't mind that. They liked that because it was kind of as if you know, it was just a very masculine way of celebrating, like, but also, I suppose, with time moved on, they were still involved with the birth as well. So it's just so many different cultural norms. And I just find that's funny when you think about people moving countries and moving around in Ireland, like it's very, you know, and Australia, there's so many different cultures move from country to country. And how do you find that, like, when supporting people, when they have these preconceptions of how it should be, and then trying to, you know, change that? Like, sometimes that can be difficult for people to change what tradition they've grown up in, you know. It's just interesting to see, because there's, like, you talk about the subconscious and our conditioning around what should be, and trying to break that down can be difficult for women as well, I think.
Yeah, and look, there are cultures that mum stays inside for 40 days, doesn't do a thing for 40 days. She's looked after completely for 40 days, doesn't lift a finger unless it has to do with the baby. And then we have, you know, women who are forced back to work 2 weeks later. So there are such polar differences in what maternity care looks like. But if we go back to what is a woman actually, what would nurture her, what would make her better, what would actually, and this is about valuing women and valuing mothers in culture, right? So some cultures value mothers. They value that role and that transition. They value the physical and emotional labor that happens in that journey from pregnancy through to birth. And interestingly, in Western culture, like in medieval times, women weren't allowed back into the church, right? So they have a churching that happens, you know, maybe a month or so after the baby was born. Now, from a feminist perspective, that's all, you know, they're not allowed back in. But the women of those times actually saw it as a blessing. They actually saw it as a space that was sacred for women to just connect and be as women together. And so they would support each other and provide this. So the industrialization that's gone along, that's also, you know, kind of had that feminist slant to it, like we have to be able to do everything that men could do, and we should be able to, but we need to honor the journey that is motherhood and the journey that is birth, because when we don't, we then create a space where women can't talk about their trauma, where they can't talk about the crappy things that happen to them at the birth, because then they're not being a good mother. So we need to be really careful about what that looks like too, and what we perpetuate as society. What is a good mother? And how many times have you heard, oh, you're a stay-at-home mum, you work already? Like, you know, you let the kids buy school lunches. Oh, you make lunches every day. Like, there's always judgment applied to everything a mother does, right? You can't get it right. And we as women apply that to ourselves sometimes. I think we just need to be really conscious about the fact that we don't need to do that. It's not a competition. It's about, if we actually just dug deep and supported each other, if we actually just took the judgment away and said, how can I be with you right now in this moment? What do you need? And not ask permission necessarily to provide that, because again, as women, and particularly Gen X, right, we have been cultured to do for ourselves. We have to do it ourselves. We have to be resilient. We have to be all these things. And if we're not, we're failing. So if you ask me, are you okay? Or can I help you? I'll say, no, I'm fine. I'm good. Might be drowning on the inside, but I'll say, I'm fine. I'm good. It's all good. Got it. But if you turn up to my house with a meal and start folding my washing, I'll probably do it with you, but I won't tell you no. And I'll be very grateful that I don't have to cook that night. So we need to stop asking women permission to support them. Just do it. Just do it. And they won't say no. And if you do it with a heart that's of love and not judgment, then you'll touch her soul and change her day, her week, her month, her year, potentially her life, right? Because when she feels that and she gets that heart connection, she takes a little something with her that she can then use to affect someone else. When I drop a woman a meal, I go scouring the op shops, right? Or my children do, or my cousin does. And I send them off to the op shop and I say, go and find me as many casserole dishes that are cheap, right? And so when I take a meal to a new mum, I take it in a casserole dish that I don't want back. And I say to her, here's your dish. This is your meal. And I explain it all to her, and it's all written on the top what she needs to do. How do I get you your bowl back? I don't want my bowl back. I want that bowl to sit in your cupboard until you're ready to pay it forward the next time.
Oh,
That's
gorgeous.
your reminder, right? So next time it'll be your turn to deliver a meal to someone. That's your reminder that that's what you're going to do.
Oh, I love that. That's fabulous, Pippa. What a lovely idea. Because, you know, the minute you say that, you know, again, women putting pressure on themselves, think, oh, I have to have this washed and ready and give it back to them, you know, kind of thing, as quick as I can. But I love that, because every time they see that, even in the cupboard, they're reminded of that beautiful, you know, kindness that was shown to them in their vulnerable stage. And you know what you were saying about even, you know, about trauma, but also about the beautiful things that can happen around when you're vulnerable, that will stay with you forever. They really stay with you forever, you know, and the idea that you can pass that on to somebody else, you know, kind of, oh, that's just gorgeous. That is a fabulous idea.
It's beautiful.
I love that. Yeah, it really is.
That's such a great idea.
I stole it from somewhere on Facebook, so it's not my idea.
Yeah. Doesn't matter. That's just lovely. Yeah.
But it's so practical, right? And I think this is, I do feel that it's like, okay, we're really clever as humans. Let's just keep finding these really practical, easy things that we can do, you know, because it's not hard and it makes such a difference. And on that note, I would like to start to wrap up, because we've just talked for 50 minutes, which is amazing. It was just such a great conversation, But Pippa, would you like to just share where people can find you, the best contact details for you in case they'd like to reach out?
Yeah, sure. So my website is www.fantasticfuture.com.au. And then just to twist it up again, if you go find me on Facebook, it's actually Fantastic Futures. I couldn't get that website, so the S is dropped on the website. So it's Fantastic Futures Australia, or on Instagram, it's Fantastic Futures birth_beyond. Reach out via email if you like. It's pippa.fantasticfutures@gmail.com. And, you know, obviously I have phone numbers all over my websites and things like that. So depending on what country you're in will depend on how you call that number. But yeah, I really would love to connect with women who just want to move into that parenting space in a really empowered way, and want to give themselves the gift of being whole and well for themselves and for their families, so that they can help in this idea of changing the world, you know.
Yeah. So that's so beautiful. Thank you so much for coming along. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Oh, thank you, Pippa, so much. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing in the world. It's fabulous. Like, so amazing to hear from so many different angles of, you know, I suppose your life experience as well, being brought into your passion. So you feel it really comes across, your passion for it, and, you know, how you're changing, you know, culture in a positive way. So thanks so much. Amazing. And thank you for everybody for watching, and on the playback and live. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Thanks, Pippa.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.